Well, it seems stores still haven't been up and running since my last video, and neither is public transportation, at least where I live. I'm not following the news very much, I don't even have cable TV, so I don't know how the rest of the world fares. But, well, at least where I live, it got really quiet over the last few months. It's alright though, I'm stocked up on canned goods, and since I haven't been able to go anywhere, I had a lot of time to work through my video game backlog. This thing is gonna last me a lifetime. Not sure how long though. Anyways, I've been working on a few videos, but since it's spooky season again, I wanted to take a look at a game I discovered years ago in 2019, when it was just a cute little demo. I've actually talked about this game earlier in a previous Halloween episode, fittingly, when I said this. Once and again, a game emerges that's an actual work of passion, full of creative and fresh ideas, an interesting presentation and a style that's not completely overused. And the day has finally come. It released in time for this year's spooky season and I've had a blast playing through it. So, join me, ghouls and gals. Come, take a seat close by the fire, keep a blanket ready to hide under it from the things that might lurk in the dark as we take a look at HorrorVale. This is the perfect game for the Halloween season. It's a macabre yet light-hearted JRPG entirely set in the underworld, in the lands of death. Everyone in here is dead, well, undead, maybe. It gets a bit complicated with some of the folks. But although there are different types of hell dwellers, with different quirks and rules applying to them, like ghosts and ghouls, vampires and werewolves, or different kinds of monsters, generally, they all count as dead and cannot be further killed just so. Having your physical form destroyed is just an inconvenience in this world. In fact, murder is just a minor crime with only 2 days in the slammer as punishment. And spooking around, getting drenched in blood, losing a limb or two are just normal occurrences of everyday life, or death in the underworld. The landscape is drenched in perpetual night, and even though this world is quite modern and technologically advanced, the scenery is heavily inspired by classic horror iconography, with the Victorian feel of the town, gothic mansions, wooden cabins deep in the forest, or flying spectral pirate ships. And the Halloween theme goes even further, with many references to mythology and folklore, urban legends, and of course other horror franchises, both classic and modern. Look at this, whenever you come across a well, your character remarks on it not being home to a creepy ghost girl, which is doubly funny once you find out that the creepy ghost girl from Ring is actually in this game and even accompanies you on your journey later. And she uses a spirit camera that charges up during her attack animation, so a reference to another game within a movie reference. The town you start in and spend a lot of time exploring could have been straight out of Nightmare Before Christmas, and since the Carnival of Souls is coming to town, the main square is decorated with paper garlands and holiday lights and carved out pumpkins. You meet pumpkin people and bedsheet ghosts, the common currency is candy, your zombified family pet and best friend is lovingly referred to as an undog, and your save point is a coffin. This is where we meet Alice, a teenage witch who's also a skeleton. As you can see, this is a retro-style top-down JRPG, which means it's more focused on presenting a static narrative than giving you a lot of means of player expression, and the RPG mechanics, like stat growth and learnable skills, generally only come into play during combat encounters. If you have a keen eye, you can see the hallmark signs of the RPG Maker engine the game was created with. But the developer stretched the engine to its limits to get as much out of it as possible. It clearly stands apart from most RPG Maker games, though to be honest, the vast majority are rather cheaply made and don't go even one step beyond the basic systems that come with the engine. And I'm only talking about the commercial games, I'm not counting experimental games or hobbyists just trying to get their ideas out there. So the game is very unique in that regard, but still utilizes the core systems of the engine, like the item and equipment system, menu operation, and structural the combat system. As such, it has much in common with games like the early Final Fantasy or Dragon Quests, the latter especially with how the somewhat random battles work. Though from its presentation and its mood, like the more humorous approach and the contemporary setting and the many memes and references to pop culture, it reminds me a lot of Earthbound or Undertale, with which it shares some of its inspirations. The story has you taking control of Alice and search for her dog, which ran away and got dog-nabbed by some creepy guy. They're actually called creepies. So now you have to travel all over this spooky little valley, explore its beautifully eerie locales, meet a bunch of frightening friends and foes, and find a way to take your dog back home. Along the way, you're gonna discover that a lot more is going on. A conspiracy is taking place with a sinister force pulling the strings from the shadows. And while the game is goofy and silly all the way through, and keeps a genuinely upbeat attitude, it doesn't hold back with the outright scary moments. One moment you're solving riddles given to you by talking trees, the next you're in a forsaken puppet mansion hunted by an unfeeling stalker. One moment you battle pumpkin warriors in a fluorescent mushroom cave, the next you're creeping through a blood-stained basement or reenact one of the more iconic SCP stories in an abandoned factory. At one point you have to help the town's inept police officers in reclaiming their own precinct, rummage through boxes of donuts, help one of the officers to remember the combination to his own locker, all while trying to evade an invincible monster that's following you through the vents. During the opening act, you're just trying to get out of your family home that your overprotective father locked with a series of arbitrary puzzles. The next act has you wreaking havoc in town to get to the mayor and ask him to open up the town gates so that you can leave and search for your dog. And then the plot slowly thickens. While the joyful moments never really disappear, they're not front and center anymore, but reserved for deliberate scenes and set pieces. Instead, we get the almost serene forest and a dangerous and treacherous bog. The enemies you encounter grow more and more disturbing the farther you get. From the silly inhabitants of HorrorVale town trying to stop your antics or just messing with you, to cold-blooded psychopaths out only for blood, or even more unsettling foes who seem to lack any purpose in committing their violent acts. But, like I said before, the game never lingers on the disturbing moments, but gets quickly back to the upbeat. It's more mischievous than horrifying. The mayor of the town is a mad scientist who put his own brain in a retro-futuristic robot body, who experimented on the townspeople and created new life out of stitched-together limbs from discarded bodies. But those guys seem to be mostly fine with it. He has more in common with Professor Farnsworth than the actual Dr. Frankenstein.
Well, getting the brain out was the easy part. The hard part was getting the brain out.
And none of the townspeople seem to agree on how to actually call him. In the forest you're hunting a giant, terrifying lizard monster, but you also need to rescue a rock band who's stuck in a pocket dimension, to get a washed-up drunkard of a bounty hunter to help you track the monster through the deep woods. Most of the enemies you fight don't take it too hard afterwards and don't hold a grudge against you. Remember, death isn't the end in the underworld, it's a continuous state of being. You'll meet many of your opponents again at a later time, where they either just make a cheeky remark or thank you and explain that they were compelled by a curse or spell or were otherwise deprived of their mental faculties. One side quest even revolves around beating up all the wandering monsters and dragging them back to town. All the goofiness doesn't mean, though, that there aren't any deep or meaningful moments in this game. Quite often the game tones down the silliness just enough to let an emotional scene play out. It strikes a careful balance between humor and genuine feeling, and by that gives the moment more gravitas. To me, this approach is, at least generally, a lot more compelling than just ramping up the drama. Not that this can't occasionally work. Of course, the beginning of Naughty Dog's The Last of Us made me feel for Joel, and so did certain scenes later in the story.
Ellie? You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
But I had more and stronger, genuine emotional responses watching shows like Scrubs or Futurama, with their expertly blended comedy and tragedy, than with most of the sad stories I consumed. Of course, Hans Christian Andersen's Little Match Girl hits hard in the feelings, but at the time, many of his stories were, in a way, the antithesis to contemporary fairy tales and children's stories that try to teach good morals through the protagonist overcoming their hardships in the end. He was the tragic counterpole to the more optimistic stories. Hell, even something as over-the-top as One Piece handles and understands the necessary tug-of-war between comedy and tragedy better than so many serious narratives. So what I'm saying is, I count this game towards the better examples. There are some really heartwarming moments, as well as heartbreaking ones. And the game, on multiple occasions, tackles themes of depression, bullying and acceptance, self-doubt and self-improvement. And it does so not in a defeatist manner or by wallowing in self-pity like so many postmodern, mostly millennial-made games or shows who seem to celebrate weakness, presumably as a way to cope with their creators' own insufficiencies, if I'm allowed the assumption, but in an optimistic way, showing the characters putting themselves out there, working hard to overcome challenges and come out as better people on the other side. And at the center of it is the main character Alice herself. A shy girl feeling very lonely. We're not given many explicit reasons for why this is the case, but a few times her overprotective father is mentioned, who prefers her to stay at home inside most of the time, even going so far as locking her in on a school night. One thing we can be sure of is that she doesn't try to avoid other people, because given the chance, she is more than ready to let others into her life, or death, and we see her all giddy when she's called a friend. And by taking chances, making an effort and putting herself out there, she finds many new friends over the course of the story. Another important ingredient in this approach is forgiveness. Villains in this story aren't irredeemable monsters. They're still monsters, this is the underworld, but that doesn't mean they have to be, or stay, bad guys. Some of them join you, some help from afar, some keep on being indifferent towards you, but nonetheless gained a new perspective on life. I mean, death. And while not everyone turns over a new leaf, that would be too absurd even for this game, there's still an emphasis on granting second chances and anyone having the capability for redemption. With a few exceptions, kind of. But I guess that's also life. Or death. But yeah, many of these little moments and side stories had me sympathize and empathize with the characters. The game intrigued me with the unique and well-developed setting, but I stayed for the well-crafted character moments. And also the really well-developed setting. The game's progression is structured into 4 acts, well, more like 4.5. Act 0 is more of a tutorial, set in the skeleton manner, where you get simple puzzles and even simpler combat to get to grips with the game's systems and mechanics. That said, it's quite representative of how the later chapters broadly work, even though it's on a way smaller scale. The front door is locked with 4 different keys that you need to find somewhere inside the house. Some are hidden behind a puzzle, some behind a combat encounter, some behind multi-step tasks. The mansion also introduces you to the kind of humor you get to expect from the game, with the enemy types you encounter, with sentient objects giving some meta commentary, and of course, Alice's own observations. And oh yeah, don't forget the memes and randomness. Over the course of the game, you come across many a bad pun or blatantly cheap references, and yet the game goes about it quite cleverly. There's this one woman in town that just says to you, "It's a terrible night to have a curse," referencing Castlevania 2 for no reason, with no setup. It's just there, it's the worst kind of nod or reference there is, and it's still the go-to method for modern entertainment. It's full with these hollow references. But the game doesn't stop here. You see, interacting with that NPC and reading that dialogue actually curses your character. Like, they receive the actual status effect cursed, which is a combat debuff. It wears off after a few steps and you receive a notice of you no longer being cursed, like with any other status effect. It's just the game's systems working how they are supposed to. But most players, me included, wouldn't even have known that they were, in fact, cursed, so that's when the actual punchline happens. The holo reference was the setup and the distraction. And yeah, I really appreciate this cheeky and playful humor. Stuff like the first ability you learn being called Heal, which is a rather powerful attack spell since you're fighting monsters and the undead, and everyone knows that the reanimated dead are allergic to medicine. To actually heal yourself or restore your death points, you're chugging a bottle of the flu, and poison heals you slowly over time. Every once in a while you encounter this comically tall male woman, and when the conversation starts, her character portrait is just a pair of legs, which just represents Alice's viewing angle. She has to look up to see the woman's face, so her character portrait also changes to represent that. When you, at a certain point, trespass on private property, you see a number of warning signs. You can see the text quite clearly on the little sprites. But you can still interact with the signs to read it anyways, and, to no surprise, the dialogue boxes just show the same text. Except for the sign with a skull, where the dialogue box reads skeleton. There's a ton of these examples all over the game, much to my amusement. It's not the most amazing jokes that have you rolling on the floor with laughter, but it's witty and enjoyable and has you just smiling ever so often. Before you can truly leave the mansion, you have to fight a boss, of course. Now, during the tutorial, everything is absurdly easy. There's only a handful of rooms for you to explore, everything is really close together, enemies die, or I guess just are defeated, in 1 or 2 hits, and not even the boss is much different in that regard. Should you, against all odds and expectations, run low on HP, you can just head to Alice's room, since her bed doubles as a full party heal and a save point. And this is actually a neat detail that ties the mechanics and the world building together. You see, since the undead can't further die, something else has to happen to their soul if their body gets too badly damaged or destroyed. So the soul, seemingly on instinct, returns to the last place it rested, slept, and once it's there, the body gets magically restored. So all these little coffins you used to save, you actually take a little nap in them. Don't ask me how the whole active party fits in there though. This even gets used at one point in the game, where you are forcibly put to sleep, so that you can't escape by just killing yourself, because your last resting spot is now at this place. And through conversations you learn that prisons use sleeping gas for the same reason, to prevent inmates from escaping. They would just wake up inside their cells if they ever tried to kill themselves. On the other hand, in the swamp is a small grove that's a favorite suicide spot for many wanderers, and real-world pendants aside that showed just how sick some people on social media can get just for the clicks, it's a really clever piece of lore. Since it's not desperation that leads the people in this case to suicide, well, I guess it's in a way, but it's just an easy ticket home if you get lost. The game refers to this little detail a few times over the course of the journey, which is really neat. And it makes it even worse that the mechanic itself is just a lie. Your soul doesn't go back to the last resting spot. You don't wake up in the last place you slept. When your party falls in combat, you get a game over. I mean, yeah, you do continue from your last save point, but the world also reverted back to when you last saved. You didn't travel there, at least not through space, but through time. And of course you lost everything you achieved and collected between your last nap and your destruction. Now this whole idea reminds me of Undertale, where the mechanic of saving the game is an actual ability your character has. Functionally, it's pretty much the same in both games. You consciously create a checkpoint, and when you die, you trigger the game over screen, and from there, return to the checkpoint and load the state of the game world from when you last saved. Just, Undertale actually explains it that way. When you die in Undertale, you return to an earlier point in time through sheer determination. But you remember what happened and are now better prepared. The final boss in one of the routes even makes use of that mechanic by creating quick saves during a barrage of attacks to throw you off. In HorrorVale, in the story, souls physically travel to their last resting place, and when your party falls during a cutscene, they do the same thing. It's just falling in a regular battle that isn't consistent with this. And I completely understand why. It would make the structure of certain puzzles and many cutscenes or set pieces so much more complicated if you could be sent back to a safe location, possibly after each encounter. It would also destroy any sense of challenge in a multi-combat encounter. And this game was made by like 2 people, with most of the actual game design done by only 1, as far as I know. It's just not feasible, especially not for such a tiny issue. You die in a battle, you lose the game. It's expected of a video game, and there's nothing wrong with it. I'd rather have it this way, where the mechanic is implied but not actually working that way, than having this really neat piece of lore removed. It would have been amazing if they managed to implement this mechanic properly, but it's still okay the way it is. As soon as you leave the mansion, your little dog runs off and you chase after him. For now, there isn't anywhere to go but straight. A crowd blocks the way deeper into town, but even after it disperses, it takes until the end of this chapter before the town fully opens up. So there's nowhere else to go but to the eastern street, where you witness a weird and rather creepy dude abducting your dog. You don't know the reason for this, but you do know that you're gonna get your best friend back, whatever it takes. And so the game truly starts. The creepy dude belongs to a weird group of monsters that recently cropped up in the valley this story takes place in. And they're called creepies, since they are, well, kinda creepy. While everyone in this world is another type of ghoulish creature or monster, and while some of them can have rather sinister personalities, these creepies are different. They seemingly only live to inflict harm on others. They can't be reasoned with, not even talked to. They are just stoically violent. And when you defeat them, they glitch out, which makes them even weirder. And because they grow more and more in numbers, the mayor has put the city under lockdown, which is a problem since the creepy fled with your dog into the woods. So you need to ask the mayor to open the town gates, but he just recently installed some security measures in the form of electric barriers. So before you can even dream of reaching him, you need to power down those barriers by deactivating 4 generators that are hidden all over town. 2 of them accessed through a combat encounter, 1 of them requiring you to engage with the crafting system, and the other one behind a little mandatory side story. That's what I meant when I said the tutorial represents the structure of the game perfectly, just on a smaller scale. Every act follows this formula. You are presented with a certain goal to accomplish, but to do so you need to first complete a number of smaller tasks in a semi-open area. Like doing favors for certain individuals, collecting the things you need for the task, removing obstacles, and sometimes these different tasks even intersect with each other. For example, in the swamp, where you need to use self-crafted potions to remove obstacles in your path, one by one, and another task rewards you with the ingredients you need for these potions. And along the way you have to crawl through a dungeon or 2. And I'm applying the word dungeon rather liberally here. I'm not only talking about winding labyrinths and the sort, but also areas like the police station or the mayor's laboratory. Both of these are mandatory, though with the police station you can somewhat decide when to tackle it and prepare accordingly, while the laboratory is a fixed point on a linear path. I guess even the town's outskirts would count as somewhat of a dungeon. Let's just put all the areas under this umbrella with more restrictive traversal, with winding paths and the like, where enemies are placed as mostly unavoidable obstacles and where, more often than not, progress is halted through simple puzzles, mostly buttons or levers, with the odd logic puzzle in between. Rather often these dungeon areas are placed back to back, having you just run along linear paths and fight random battles for long stretches at a time. It appears that the chapters front-load all the goofy conversations and story moments and leave most of the dungeon crawling for the end, which I guess is just a natural result of this game's approach to progression. It has actually more in common with games like Deus Ex than with its JRPG peers, since you're always able to access multiple objectives at a time within a large enough area, and more or less complete them at your own pace, until you got all the criteria met to open up the chapter's finale, and that's where the dungeon gauntlet starts. I guess it could be done differently, but that would either mean restricting the player more and more often, or risk having the chapters become bloated by adding more free exploration areas even throughout the later parts of a chapter. And some of the areas already have to deal with a bit of bloat just within the dungeon sections and could use some trimming down. The woods were annoyingly long, maybe just cutting down one area in the middle would have already alleviated that issue. And the final chapter has way too many sterile and similar looking hallways. strewn in between the sometimes more and sometimes less obvious mandatory tasks are side quests, which are clearly marked as such, so you don't have to worry about running errands for random people, even though all you want to do is progress in the story. Though with me it's generally the other way around. I don't want to leave the area until I completed all the side quests. And with how progression is structured, these side quests mingle neatly in between the mandatory activities. There's no real difference in having to craft a shrinking potion to reach one of the generators in town and having to craft a death potion, which actually restores your HP in the game, to complete a side quest and gain a new ally, or having to craft a curse lifting potion to free some nymphs that locked off paths you need to get through. The crafting system in this game is actually quite extensive, not very complex, but there's just a rather large number of different ingredients and combinations, though to be fair, I mostly just engaged with the system when it was needed for a quest. I experimented once with some ingredient combinations and crafted a handful of healing and stat boost potions, but I don't think I ever even used them, since most of the time I had a party member with some good buffs and a healer with me, and healing items at the shop aren't too expensive. I also never found any recipes or stuff like that, so crafting stayed a trial and error affair. There is a quick brew option to recreate any recipe you've discovered, so that's good, but I think it would have been neat to either find notes that tell you about recipes or hear about them in conversations, or being able to buy them and have them immediately added to your quick brew list. It is possible to craft a dot, and these won't get jotted down in your quick brew list, so depending on how many resources you have, the trial and error could get a bit annoying. But again, I never really felt the need to engage very much with the system. During Act 1 there are only a handful of side quests, and 2 of them can't even be completed at this point but are whole game spanning quests. 2 other side quests reward you with your first 2 party members, and it's highly recommended to do them, so you're well equipped for the challenges ahead. That only leaves one last side quest that isn't too special in and of itself, but since you're already running back and forth through town, there's no harm in completing it along the way. Now, side quests come in a few different flavors. Sadly, the most prevalent ones have you arbitrarily running all around previously visited areas. The better ones send you around in a circle, but many force you to run back and forth between the quest giver and different locations just ever so far enough away to make it annoying. Sometimes it's cheekily lampshaded and played for laughs, though that doesn't make them much better than the ones that play it straight. Run back and forth in town to collect the things your ditzy friend forgot or misplaced. Run back and forth in town just to talk to different people. Run back and forth in the bog, where traversal is already a bit cumbersome due to the map's layout. Or, the least annoying but the most indulgent, run back and forth between the quest giver and your save point within the same area to swap out party members and present them to the NPC, since he can't just ask for all of them at once, but only one at a time. This quest in particular doesn't gain anything from this. The puzzle doesn't become more difficult, there is no challenge along the way, it just wastes more of your time for no reason. Not even a simple visit to the burger joint for milkshakes can't end without a wild goose chase all over town. Then there's side quests that send you to a previously visited location, and you have to do something new there. Mostly fighting a special enemy or collecting certain items. These are fine, nothing special, and the game doesn't overdo them. You only have to revisit an already explored dungeon section maybe once, at most twice with these side quests. So there's not much to complain about. And then there's the side quests that offer fresh activities, new content. Some are taking place inside new dungeons that are sometimes extensions of older dungeons, like the inner sanctum of the candy mines, the underground laboratory in the bog, or the card realm behind a hidden mirror. And I shouldn't forget the whole-ass Zelda 1 dungeon that's not just visually referring to the game, but also with how the enemies behave in combat, like the skellingtons that have a jump ability that ludicrously raises their evasion, which makes them as annoying to fight in this game as in the game they're originally from. Other quests have you do little special challenges or minigames. One of the early side quests introduces the farming mechanic that you can utilize to help with all your crafting needs. But the same as the crafting system, you don't really need it outside of specific quests. The quest also has you fight against and alongside were-hamsters, which is just hilarious. And of course there are some fighting tournament quests, with one of them masked as a dance-off. So there's some good variety of side quests in this game, some better, some worse, but none of them drag on too much, so even the more tedious ones aren't all too bad. And they're often accompanied by some well-written character moments and witty dialogues, so I can't really be too annoyed by them. Also, you can complete many of these while you're working on the main quest in an arc, since, as I said, the open-ended design of the progression in each arc blends perfectly with the side quests. The main quest itself offers some great variety, diverse environments and a lot of small, unique activities to break up the core gameplay. It doesn't always go smoothly, the engine just isn't designed for complex minigames and the game does suffer from the rpgmaker limitations quite a bit. There are minigames where you float or glide around and have to precisely avoid obstacles, but the rigid, grid-based movement makes it feel really clunky. Same with the shooting gallery. You're not actually aiming at a physical object. The game just checks if the center of your crosshair character and the center of the target character are on the same square on the grid when you press the button. The farming minigame is, well, rudimentary. Again, the rpgmaker really isn't equipped for these sorts of mechanics. These minigames don't get too frustrating, but depending on the RNG, they can get a bit annoying. It's still amazing how much effort the team put into them and into the sheer variety of things to do. As for the locations you get to visit, the town of HorrorVale is the main hub in this game, with many friendly NPCs, side quests and shops. Each following act has their respective little hub town, though none of them are as large or dense as the first one. And I already mentioned the police station. This one is a clear nod towards the Resident Evil games, since you have to find your way around locked doors by collecting a bunch of different keys and solve a few puzzles. The caves in the town's outskirts and the mayor's laboratory are the labyrinths you'd expect from JRPG dungeons. But they are presented quite differently from one another. At the end of Act 1 we already got some good visual variety with all the different environments. And after that, there's the woods, that contain a few too many labyrinth areas, but also mines, mystical caves, a scary abandoned sawmill, and a nightclub. Act 3 opens with a murder mystery inside a gothic mansion, which turns into an episode of Danganronpa halfway through, music and all. Then there's the bog, where you have to traverse islands connected by boardwalks and bridges, or wade through the blood swamp. You have to delve into ancient imposing castles, abandoned factories, or obliterated laboratories inhabited by the mutilated, insane versions of the former scientists. Oh yeah, when the game wants to get dark, it goes all the way. And this also holds true for the story. Yeah, it starts off innocent and goofy, but pretty early on it shows that there's more to it, that something sinister is going on. It becomes kind of a running gag that everyone's first priority is getting Alice's dog back, while dangerous new monsters are running amok, seemingly being controlled by unknown forces with unknown goals, even when the future of the whole valley is at stake. The story actually offers a lot of intrigue and has some generally good payoffs at the end. From the start, you occasionally notice a weird, creepy girl observing you. You can't get close to her, she either vanishes when you approach her, or you just lose sight of her. You actually come face to face with her at the end of Act 2, where you find out that she's the one controlling the creepies, and also the one that had your dog abducted. It's not yet revealed why, but she's clearly emotionally unstable and causes massive havoc when you try to get the dog from her. You still manage to disrupt her operation, and that's when the creepies slowly awaken, as the game calls it, and become sentient, stopping their murderous rampage, mostly, and trying to build a life for themselves. With some of them even actively helping your efforts to rescue your dog. There's the element of redemption again that I mentioned fairly early in the video. It's pretty interesting how the story is told. While there is an overarching narrative and a through line from the start of Act 0 until the end of Act 4, each of the chapters has its own somewhat self-contained story and villain. The antagonist of Act 1 is the misguided and, frankly, insane Mayor Frankenstein, who quickly sees the error of his ways and joins forces with Alice, supporting her on her quest in the hopes of simultaneously stopping the creepy menace. Act 2's big bad is the creepy girl, but after, well, it's not really defeating her, let's say. After inconveniencing her, she disappears for a while and loses control over her minions. At this point she stops being an antagonist and a new one is quickly introduced. She will have a few more appearances before the game is over and there will be more confrontations with her. But even so, I wouldn't call her an actual antagonist anymore. She kinda is, but there's more to it. It gets a bit complicated, in a good way, once we learn where she comes from, what her goal is. Let's just say she's not the villain of this game. The actual villain is quite weak. No, that's not entirely true. It's not really the villain themselves who's bad. They are actually quite well written. I mean, just because I don't really get to know them and learn everything about them doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of thought put into them. My problem is more so that they just appear as a twist within a twist, and the final chapter already was too much subversion for my taste. It broke with the Halloween theme, not fully, there's still a lot of nods to horror concepts and franchises there, but the tonal shift is just jarring. Though it did shake up the progression structure in a fun way, with subverting the concept of climatic showdowns and trying more so to surprise the player with fun and creative conflict resolutions. At least until the finale is triggered. But for the true mastermind, as it stands now, it's more of a surprise villain. Albeit one that got foreshadowed a lot throughout the whole game. I expected a different payoff to this foreshadowing, but I wasn't disappointed. Maybe I would have appreciated the true villain more if the final chapter had fully focused on them and not the diversionary faction. The actual finale is amazing. It's full of emotional payoff, badassery, revelations, anime bullshit, everything that makes a great scene. But even the greatest, flashiest payoff is worth nothing without the proper setup. And this is where the characters come in. Alice herself is mostly a silent protagonist. I say mostly because she speaks a handful of sentences throughout the game. At first this came off a bit odd, because the game does the whole spiel with characters in dialogue just expounding what Alice would say, or not taking notice of her at all. Sometimes they comment on Alice being always silent or shy, but then, at very arbitrary moments, she just talks. I thought I misinterpreted this at first. Maybe it was her inner dialogue, but no, she actually talks, like 3 or 4 times during the game. And always just a single sentence. At first it seemed to me that the developer wasn't quite sure how to write Alice and maybe had to make a few corrections after the fact and missed a few things, but that's absolutely not the case. She becomes quite talkative after the resolution of her arc, and even then, while the game does mention the fact, it doesn't make too big of a deal out of it. Retroactively, it made for a very consistent character that still was on a journey to improve herself, in a very natural way. She's just a bit shy and doesn't get out very much. She's not suffering from crippling anxiety. And if we're being fair, then there are a whole bunch of moments where she talks, when we count all the different dialogue options and decisions. She doesn't get a whole text box for herself with those, but they are written in character, and a lot of times we only get a single option, making it even more obvious that these are her lines, not just an extension of the player. And it shows that she's not a blank slate, but we also get that from her reactions in cutscenes and on the character portraits. I guess the only thing I would have changed is the way her dialogue is presented. Just make her lines another single dialogue option and it's consistent with the rest of her conversations. Alice isn't alone on this adventure though. You can recruit up to 31 party members. Only 3 of them are mandatory, all the other ones are unlocked through side quests. Now, with such a huge cast, there's a good chance that not everyone gets their chance to shine. Not everyone is as deep as possible or has an elaborate backstory. And well, that's exactly the case in this game. But it's not really a problem here. Chrono comes to mind as another game with a huge cast of optional characters. But that game didn't go about as cleverly as this here. Or better, HorrorVale actually learned from earlier examples in video games and improved the things that didn't work. Chrono Cross isn't an inferior game because its character roster caused more issues than HorrorVale's. There's 25 years of learning and improving between those two games. Chrono Cross got all the criticisms I mentioned before. Also, since you were able to mostly freely mix and match your party composition, some cutscenes or confrontations could be less impactful, since the most fitting characters for the scene might not be in your active party. HorrorVale works around these issues in a few clever ways. So the cutscenes are only designed around the mandatory party members, and they are always with you in those. They just plop out of your body, like in the good old days. There actually was a pretty funny rpgmaker game back in the day that made fun of this generally agreed upon way to show your characters joining your party or entering a scene. There are also some moments in the game where your active party members can join in on a conversation or comment on something that happened. And at first it appeared like all scenes are influenced by your party loadout. I was doing a bunch of character quests back to back before progressing with the story, so I hadn't anything to compare it against. But when I continued with the story and saw only certain characters appear out of Alice's body, even if they weren't part of my current team, I understood how it worked. It's still fine, and a few little flavor comments give the quests a more personal feel. It just sometimes looks a bit goofy when you entered a scene from a direction the devs didn't expect, and then the characters stand inside of each other because your active party members are always following in goose step and aren't accounted for in these scenes. This, again, could have been done better, but it would have required a ton of work for very little payoff, so I understand why this has been left as it is. Having the story scenes designed around a handful of mandatory party members and not the rest of the roster means, though, that they get a lot more screen time and character development than all the others. It's just a fact, but the game tries to compensate for it in a way, with, again, the little flavor lines. You most certainly pick a few favorites from the roster to accompany you for most of the journey, so these little lines will accumulate and flesh out these specific characters a bit more, almost like you're getting to know them better. This also makes the playthrough unique for each player. I spend a lot of time with the mask guy and Jackie, who's also kind of a mask guy, and they became very dear to me. It didn't feel like they were just combat utilities, because they contributed a lot to the dialogues. As for the issue that not every party member is important to the story or has a detail-rich backstory, well, they don't really need to, right? There are some party members that have a deeper connection to Alice, like friends from school or her sister. Then there's people with stakes in the current happenings, and then there's just random guys who tag along because they have nothing better to do and you were nice to them. And you know what? The latter ones don't blabber about their tragic past, they don't have the most complicated and personal character quests, they don't form the deepest bond with Alice. They're acquaintances who think it's the right thing to do to accompany you. Now, some of their quests can be pretty insightful, but that's not the goal with all of them. Some are just here to have some fun. Now, with the other party members, you get quite a bit out of their personal quests. It's all about getting to know them better, getting to understand them as they work to better themselves, or coming to terms with the things they can't change. They are all well fleshed out for what they are supposed to add to the experience, and they all have a unique personality different from the others. It's fun to experiment with the different party compositions and mix and match all the characters you find interesting. And this is encouraged by the game with a few ingenious design decisions. First and foremost, there are no individual character levels, just an overall party level. Now you might think that dumps down the RPG even more, and you might be right, but in a JRPG, more often than not, there's already not that much stat and ability customization, so all this does is reduce the amount of grinding, and I'm all for that. So since everyone is on the same level at all times, swapping out characters whenever you want, maybe because you think they fit a certain encounter better, is no problem and comes with no downside. Next, the amount of equipment stays rather manageable. This game is the opposite of a looter shooter. At the end of the game, after having completed all side quests and beaten the secret bosses, because yeah, there are some of those in the game, I had maybe 5 or 6 weapons for Alice, less for the others. Some weapons are side grades and some have just plain better stats, but it never gets too complicated. And aside from the bare-handed fighters, and there are a lot in the game which use totems, everyone has their own unique weapon type. No, that's not true. The masked guy uses a video camera and the Japanese well ghost Juno uses a photo camera. So both of them equip a lens as a weapon, so they share the same weapon type. Oh, and also Kenneth, the bedsheet ghost on legs, and Mizure, a Hashihime, use boots to fight. So they as well share a weapon set. Yeah, I think that's all. It's still very much manageable. You don't need to constantly swap your equipment around because there are long stretches of gameplay before you find something better. As for armor, the game uses talismans, and they are as simple as they get. They mostly just boost a single parameter, so attack, defense, magic, luck, all that good stuff. In later chapters you are able to buy more powerful talismans that give larger boosts to a single stat. And then there's charms and rings, and those offer the most customization. They come in all kinds of flavors, some boosting your stats even further, some giving you regeneration for either health or magic, some prevent status effects, some change your element, some give you the ability to counterattack. There's a lot. And here it might get a bit tedious to outfit your team. If you ever want to change your party members but their rings and charms are tailored to a certain situation, it's quite cumbersome to scroll through all of them, find the equipment you need and swap back and forth. This is more so a problem in how the rpgmaker engine works. It wasn't designed for massive party sizes. If you only have to manage 4 guys, it's not a problem. But if it's 20 or 30, it becomes a bit much. I guess the devs considered this, and that's why there aren't hundreds of slightly different equipment pieces in the game. But that's pretty much it for party management. Yeah, don't expect deep RPG mechanics. But for a game like this, I even prefer it that way. This game's focus isn't on the combat, as we will see. There's not even that many battles in the game. I mean, it's still a lot, but compared to other JRPGs, especially of that length and with that amount of content, it's not even close. There are only a few enemies per screen, and they, for the most part, don't respawn. So there isn't even any grinding. The last area gets a bit more combat heavy, and it is noticeable, but for the most part, the game stays rather light on combat encounters. And as you can see, it doesn't even feature random encounters out of nowhere. Mostly. It's mostly driven by the story, the characters, and the atmosphere. Stats increase passively with each level up, and the spells and abilities are also automatically learned at certain levels. You don't need to accumulate skill points and spend them at trainers or learn new abilities through usage, so once more the game encourages swapping party members around and just experiment with all their abilities. Only the ultimate ability for each character has to be manually unlocked by completing their personal quest. For that, you have to visit your little hideout inside a pocket dimension. It's a really neat idea. It's this little diner in the middle of nowhere where your companions just sit down and rest, have a drink, gaze at the stars, or just sit down by the fire. Here you can talk to your friends and also start their personal quest once it is available. Sometimes 2 or even 3 characters share a personal quest, so it only becomes available once you found all the required characters. I already talked about how these quests work. Mechanically, they don't really differ from the rest of the side quests. They're even listed in the same section within your little diary. The reward for completing these character quests is always their ultimate ability, with the exception of Alice herself. To unlock her ultimate, she has to first gather all 31 party members and then complete the, I guess, hardest dungeon in the game. The battles seemed to be harder than the ones at the end of the final chapter, and the bosses for sure were harder. But the reward for this is this awesome Reaper Scythe Slice that just shaves off 10% of an enemy's health, especially as an opening move, highly effective. So yeah, now that we talked about equipment, party members and abilities, let's talk about combat. Battles are rpgmaker standard, with a few refinements. It's turn-based JRPG combat. You select either your standard attack or special abilities, guard or use items. It works generally like any other JRPG. All combatants have certain resistances and weaknesses, so certain attacks inflict more damage on certain enemies, and the same goes for status effects. Instead of the classic 4 elements of nature, or weapon type based damage like piercing or slashing, the game doubles down on its spooky scary skeleton theme and uses elements like blood, bone, flesh, ectoplasm, and of course, sugar, among others. Each element has specific weaknesses and resistances, which you can read up on in the tutorial section in your diary, though this isn't handled all too consistently. You regularly have to face monsters that break the rules and have more or different resistances. I also didn't find it very intuitive to make out which element an enemy belongs to, and I outright ignored it for my party members. It never affected my tactics. But yeah, maybe you're just not supposed to see at a glance what element an enemy has. Maybe the game wants you to always have someone with you who can scan the enemy and remember it for later. I mean, there are some general rules, but as soon as the creepies and other abnormal enemies cropped up, I mostly just threw my most powerful attacks at them to see what sticks. Which, to be fair, is a valid approach. You see, the game isn't the hardest one out there. There certainly is some challenge, and you do need to exploit enemy weaknesses, apply buffs and debuffs, keep tabs on all your party members' health, but it never gets overwhelming. It helps that all party members have access to different attack types, so most of the time you will have at least one teammate with you with the right tools for the job. And I guess it was also a deliberate decision to give Alice, as a witch, spells from almost every element. And since she's a mandatory party member for the vast majority of this game's runtime, you always have at least one powerful spell against most enemies, assuming you're leveled up enough. So I could pretty much always make a comeback if I needed a bit longer to figure out which abilities work best against an enemy, not that it ever got too complicated. Even the strongest boss in the game was very manageable, and the only enemy that required a bit more awareness from me was this samurai that changed his stance every few turns, which let him counter different types of attacks. Only one fight appeared as though I was completely underleveled or underprepared. I was forced to use a specific party composition and the boss mopped the floor with me. But as it turned out, it was just a bit of bad luck coupled with me underestimating the boss. The next attempt went a lot smoother. It didn't become mindless, but just a bit of planning went a long way. Now, there are some special enemies. Their fights are more so puzzles than actual combat challenges. Every once in a while, you will encounter an enemy with a red name. This means they're either extremely difficult or outright invincible. You actually meet one of them during the tutorial. It's a stubborn ghost and he just refuses to let himself get damaged. This reminds me once again of Undertale. But yeah, you need to collect some salt from the kitchen and use it on him to exorcise him and defeat him immediately. Let's just say that half of the red named enemies work like that. You have to find out their secret weakness before you can actually defeat them. Though I guess I weakened some of them accidentally, because I was able to beat them, but couldn't for the life of me understand how I did it. But still, some of them require some really creative solutions. The other half of the red named enemies has you solve a puzzle on the exploration screen, so outside of battle. The first one of those is the creepy inside the police station. You have no chance of fighting him, but after you've made your way through the station, it starts a kind of chase sequence that ends with you trapping it in the shower room and electrocuting it, which weakens it enough for you to fight it. So these special enemies mostly require you to lure them to a specific location or avoid them for long enough until you've progressed far enough for them to get automatically weakened. So they're more so there for a bit of tension during exploration and dungeon crawling and not really for the challenge. Now, the whole fun of the combat system stems from how all the different party members behave during battles, and the devs went all out on them. It's pretty amazing, and the only other game I remember to pull this off was Final Fantasy VI. You know, having a bunch of different party members with actual gameplay differences, not just different stats and the odd special ability. Where Terra for the first half of the game was the only one able to use magic.
King Edgar was able to buy tools and use them in combat. Sabin, as a martial artist, had you input combo chains for his special attacks. Cyan needed to charge up his attack in real time. The Yeti was always afflicted by rage. Gao could just run off with the enemy to learn their attacks. And there were still more party members in this game. I saw some small notion of this in Eiyuden Chronicles, and since this one is a spiritual successor to Suikoden, which I didn't play, I could imagine that one having as much variety with the different party members as well. While this game here doesn't offer fancy button prompts or quicktime events or other minigames during combat, it does get the most out of the rpgmaker engine to make the characters feel different from each other. Of course, there are some standard JRPG characters that handle how you'd expect. And not all of your 32 party members, even more if we count temporary party members, are truly unique. There are some variants of the same archetype. So you will find a few characters that are simply strong fighters who mostly use their standard attack and maybe have a few special abilities. Or casters who focus on special abilities, or supports who also focus on special abilities, but more so to aid the party instead of dealing damage. Standard so far. But then there are the more creative ones, and there's a lot of them. One of your first available party members, Jekyll, is a weak fighter with a medium strength special attack and a few buffs. But every few turns he transforms into a buff version of himself that can't use special abilities but is a lot stronger. So you have to plan around this transformation with your buffs. A mob boss you can recruit uses candy, so your currency, for his attacks, but is also able to extort candy from the enemy. The masked guy is similar to Final Fantasy's Blue Mage. By recording certain enemies, he can learn their attacks and use them himself. Additionally, using an enemy skill changes his appearance and alters his standard attack. He's one of the most versatile and useful characters in the game, even outside of battle, since he can translate pretty much everything for you and talk to certain monsters you wouldn't be able to understand. Prince Henry is a summoner who's able to conjure previously defeated bosses. Some characters don't use mana for their special attacks, or health in some instances, but need to build up spirit energy by dealing or receiving damage. One of them, the hero Chris, even gets a transformation as soon as her spirit points reach 100%. Then there are characters that require some setup to get the most out of their attacks. The hunter Webbs McGregor, who's the most endearing to me because every line of dialogue from him is pure gold. But he has some actual sneak attacks, meaning you need to use a turn in combat to hide and then attack from the shadows for added damage. In a similar way, the werehamster Barnaby can stuff food into his cheeks and either swallow it to heal himself or spit it out as an attack. Even Buckethead joins your team. So that's where he hangs out when he isn't performing on stage or writing songs for John Romero's new Doom Ward.
So this game just wants to give you some good, old-fashioned fun. The story doesn't take itself too seriously, and neither do the character moments or the little side ventures, but it's still very well written and full of meaningful moments. It actually accomplishes a lot with what is given, without crossing the line into pretentiousness.
Conversations are all fun to follow because all the characters are genuinely well written. The dialogue is witty and the imaginative character sprites and the expressive character portraits, along with the snappy and creative presentation, make the conversations feel alive. The characters ooze personality and the world building is really strong and well thought through, making the light-hearted humor come off naturally, without breaking the immersion. Like, quests are little notes written down in Alice's diary, as well as the story summaries. And for no other reason than to be cute, you can even select the photograph of her dog to enlarge it, and do nothing else with it. There's even a very Kojima-esque puzzle where a character wants a potion from you and just states that you should know how to craft it. Well, at that point it's reasonable to assume that you haven't had the chance to try a lot of different ingredients. And there are no written recipes to find. But if you just take a look at the crafting tutorial page, you see the recipe in one of the screenshots. Stuff like this is just amazing, and it annoys me that I don't come up with such creative ideas. Visually, the game is, for the most part, really pleasant. The different environments are all detailed and full of creative designs. Only the final major area was a bit bland at times. There's not much you can do with bright hallways, but even here the map design is playful and tries to stay varied. A highlight for me were the moments where you need to shrink down. You get these Minish Cap inspired areas where you're walking between giant blades of grass or inside door frames or machines. They don't do anything too crazy, but it's just so very charming. There are some times where the art isn't all that amazing, or better, you can see some stark differences in quality when it comes to the sprite work over the course of the game. But it always fits the mood the game tries to convey, and it always clearly shows that an effort was made. Nothing appears cheap in this game. And all the little details that are way too much effort for how easy they are to overlook by most players just show how much the devs care, and it gives the game just so much charm. Like how the lich that allows you to swap your party members pulls out an umbrella when it starts raining, or how the larger or broader characters tilt to the side when they are close to a wall or obstacle they would bump against. Or that you ride on the shoulders of one of your larger teammates while traversing the swamp. Or the very situational alternate skins. Or the elaborate battle animations that even take into account when you have temporarily an alternate skin for a character. Or the enemy sprites during battles that sometimes change to show combat damage. The battle system is actually full of such little details, not only visually, but every enemy type has their own battle music. So regular undead battles sound different from fights against creepies. Or the netherlings that show up every once in a while to just annoy you. Or the scaries that appear in later chapters. And of course, bosses or mini-bosses. It took me a bit to realize, but it actually makes it way easier to collect all the special abilities for Mask Guy, since you immediately know what type of enemy you're fighting and could avoid wasting your turns trying to record the wrong enemy. The music overall is pretty great. It's full of strong melodies, which is only expected of SNES-style JRPGs, but there's more to it. Same as pretty much everything else in the game, the soundtrack is extremely varied, containing all kinds of different genres, all spookified. The soundtrack knows when to be upbeat, when to be suspenseful, when to be emotional, and when to let loose. The battle themes in particular stood out to me because of their creative uses of samplings from other songs or voice lines, or modem sounds in the case of the Creepies theme. It made these songs really unique. We get cartoonishly silly melodies and upbeat tunes. We get the town theme that reminds me so much of Nightmare Before Christmas. And the more playful but similar theme of the Skeleton Manor. We get the calming and serene forest theme with just a hint of mystique that has a lot in common with the Haunted Woods from Donkey Kong Country 2. Funnily enough, while a former Rare composer did collaborate with the team, it wasn't David Wise, but Grant Kirkhope, whose style, I guess, fits the overall mood of the game better. Not that he contributed that much. We get the Vampire Mansion with its Rococo feel. And it seems the music at Barnaby's farm alludes to Harvest Moon's soundtrack, so the referential humor even extends to the music. And as a bonus, the smooth jazz theme of your little hideout is called Peppermint Tea, so it kinda seems like it was custom made for me.
The game is just such a blast to play. It gave me so much joy from start to finish. But more, it gave me so many compelling little stories, characters to empathize with, morals to consider. This is more than just a funny little Halloween game. This game is about facing adversity and overcoming hardships. It's a game about redemption and forgiveness. It's a game about coming to terms with the past and working towards a brighter future. It's a game about opening up to others and taking chances. It's a story about a girl looking for her dog and the friends she made along the way. This has been Rady, and I wish you a very happy Halloween, get some candy, and I'll see you on the next game.